All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Singer. I'm a managing partner here at Osage University Partners in charge of our tech investment practice. Today, we're going to be having a conversation on healthcare IT startups, and we're fortunate to have three panelists join us on the webinar. First, we have David Dorsey, who's an associate at Osage University Partners with me. We have Tom Hawes, who's a managing director of Sandbox Industries, and Samir Manjure, who's the CEO and co-founder of KenSci, which is a University of Washington spinout in which OUP is a proud investor. We decided to talk about healthcare IT today because many of our partner universities have been asking us about it. So we've seen what I'll call renewed interest among our tech transfer partners to look further into the space and get smarter as they start making intellectual property and company development decisions in HIT. At OUP, we've been reasonably active in the HIT sector for the last several years. We've made a few HIT investments. So I would say it's a modest part of our portfolio, but we've also done a reasonable amount of scouting within the health systems of our partner universities, looking for interesting technologies that ultimately could turn into future startups. As we'll discuss shortly, healthcare IT is a highly diverse emerging sector with many startups competing in a really broad marketplace where everybody is focused on how do we improve healthcare data, healthcare delivery, and outcomes as our $3 trillion healthcare system gradually transitions over towards value-based care. As you'll see shortly in some slides that David will present, since 2014, a substantial amount of VC funding has poured into the sector. And our goal today is to help provide guidance to you in terms of how to think about this market as it continues to mature, and how do you think about creating a spin out in this space. It is worth noting at the start that healthcare IT can be really difficult to define, and depending on who you talk to, you find very different definitions. Sometimes people define it as anything digital as it relates to health. And this broad definition can encompass lots of startups that we won't really talk about today, which would include consumer health companies such as wearables or fitness companies, and also medical diagnostic companies, which we at OUP invest in, such as blood-based diagnostics. But for today's discussion, we're not going to focus that broadly. We're going to focus more on the information technology side of HIT, which are primarily software and data-driven healthcare opportunities. If you do have questions about other sectors in this related space, feel free to ask us, and there's a Q&A box so you can ask us questions at any time. So our goal today is to have a panel discussion, but also have lots of Q&A. So at any point in time, please do feel free to type in questions. It won't interrupt the flow of our conversation, and we'll queue them up, and we'll try to get to every question along the way. We will present some slides with some data. But to come back to KenSci, KenSci is one of those rare both healthcare IT companies and rare university spinouts that really quickly got to revenue and had some pretty significant revenue contracts, which is what catalyzed a pretty significant venture round. So Samir or Sunny, it'd be great for one of you just to talk through the story and the history of what did you do when you found the university technology? How did it develop into a company? How did you so quickly get to revenue where that is often kind of a challenge for early stage university spinouts in this space?
Yeah, great question, Mark. My co-founder, Ankur Desai, he's a tenured professor at University of Washington who was doing research for about 6 years in this space. And Ankur and I have known each other for about 30 plus years. We had been talking about doing something together in either healthcare or education space for a while. So the story is this, right? Before we spun out KenSci as an entity. We did some groundwork in terms of understanding what is the applicability of this research and how do we marry this with a channel play with a large entity like Microsoft or other channel partners, so that it doesn't stay in its research mode, but we had a plan where we could take this research and quickly vet out certain things with enterprise customers in the first quarter after the launch itself. So we had a bunch of things that we kept kind of, we planned for on day one when we launched KenSci. And as a result of that, while we were building the product, we had a initial version that we could go to with to the existing relationships that we had through the university as well as to the Microsoft channel partnerships. And that really helped us significantly learn more about how do we take the research and operationalize it in a real world situation. And in my view, that is the key. If you want to kind of, have a university spin out which is working on one point problem or kind of, just exploring multiple dimensions to a problem, how do you take that and really understand the nuances of the industry you are in so that you can quickly operationalize it? And then have from day one a mentality that everything that you do is a playbook. It is not going to be one-off. So you have to make some hard choices in terms of how do you create that playbook from day one. And it's going to be a journey, but the more you focus on that playbook approach, the easier it gets in terms of attracting customers. So that was really our kind of, genesis behind on this one from day one. And then in parallel, we got Sunny on board, who had worked with the Microsoft channel partner for many years, and we were able to quickly kind of, scale from one territory to another territory, even before we got any funding. So the idea is again to test it out and, be in a position where when you go and approach a VC, you already have a very good story with revenue and, channel playbooks to showcase. And that's what helped us kind of, quickly get like 5-6 term sheets, even though we were not even looking for funding at that time. And then we chose a partner in Ignition, Osage, and one of the VC funds actually in LATAM. So, the goal was again to choose a VC fund, which is more of a partner rather than just an investor. And we raised our Series A last year for $8.5 million. That was the only raise we did. We hadn't taken any funding before that, not even an angel round or anything. So yeah, happy to answer and go into more details, but that's kind of the high level around the journey of KenSci, where we started and kind of how we quickly, within a couple of quarters of selling, grew to a couple of $1 million plus in ARR.
Yeah. And obviously it was one of the things that really interested us as we invested. And I would say that pattern of being kind of commercially focused really early, basically as you're starting the company, is a consistent theme. There is a very similar theme in Pickwell, which is a company we invested in out of Penn alongside Sandbox, which is on the decision support side for healthcare IT, where very early on they were very thoughtful about getting to potential customers early, getting some early contracts, which also helped them. I wanted to hit one thing, Samir, that you talked about before we switch over to Tom and talk about Sandbox, which is, your first thing you did as you were trying to be commercially minded was to go to University of Washington and utilize kind of the system there. And we often see with healthcare IT startups, in particular software companies or data-driven companies, that they're really good at utilizing their source university as a partner. And often they have one contract with one customer or not even a paid contract and engagement. And then it gets hard to cross out of that environment to get to a second customer. And was there anything in particular you did that you felt like made it easier to get that second engagement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, again, you have to go and start. Most of the university work is focused on research and not necessarily, thinking about the commercial angle, right? Luckily, in our case, Ankur was very focused on also thinking through a little bit, a couple of steps ahead. And when we partnered, we had a couple of customers who kind of, on day one, were ready to kind of, engage with us. But in addition to that, we had primed up with my kind of background in Microsoft and the channel play that was there. We were able to quickly kind of, figure out at least all the key health systems in Northwest and kind of, get to them in a very, very short time frame. In addition to that, we had, we quickly built up a value prop, and thanks to Sunny, honestly, where he came in, we normally, very research-based and tech-focused companies don't hire, growth officers or marketing, product marketing folks early on. And for us, having Sunny from the beginning, was a big help, because he was able to quickly come up with, take the work and create very detailed playbooks with the channel. And that helped us kind of, go and reach out to multiple C-level folks right in the beginning, and helped us kind of, come to the table with a very high degree of credibility. And I think that really helped us kind of scale from initial 1 or 2 engagements to, a dozen or so within less than a year.
Great, and the growth really has been remarkable so far. So Tom, why don't we transition over to you and have you talk a little bit more about Sandbox, a little bit more about your model, and what makes it special, your investment strategy, and then we'll start talking about the environment in general, like where is there activity, where is there investor interest, and talk about kind of the HIT market overall.
Sure, sounds good. So just a little history on Sandbox, which I think is helpful to understand how we arrived at what we're doing at today, because certainly it's been an evolution. So Sandbox was started about 13 years ago by Bob Shapiro and Nick Rosa. So Bob and Nick had a great run in the corporate world of figuring out how to take technologies in the agriculture space and commercialize them, mostly in the life sciences and animal health. And when they semi-retired, they thought, hey, let's keep working together. We'll start Sandbox, and then we'll start a company. We'll call it Sandbox because that's a cool name, and then we'll figure out what it does. Well, not long into the history of Sandbox, they happened to meet up with an executive at the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association who saw an opportunity to get a bunch of big health insurers, specifically the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, to collaborate and work together when it comes to investing and supporting innovation. Well, as this group I'm sure knows, anytime you get more than 2 people in a room, it's really hard to, bureaucracy tends to build, and it's hard to get stuff done within just one big corporation or university. And so imagine if you were to put all the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans together, it'd be a Fortune 3. So these are really big companies. And so it was an audacious goal and vision. But after hammering out a model which attempted to bring the best characteristics of corporate venture together with the best aspects of traditional venture, we got the first fund set up in 2008. That's when I joined. And we got 11 of the 30, at that point, 38 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans to not only provide capital, but actually to comprise a general partner, which makes the investment decisions. And then Sandbox was the fund manager, was hired as the fund manager. And so the way it works, we work very collaboratively and closely with the general partner, which is, again, made up of a board of Blue executives from all the plans that invested, and meet with them in person once a quarter, but talk to the individual executives from that board quite often. And then there's an executive from the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association named John Banta, who we work with several times a week, at least, if not every day, and look really hard for companies of any and all stages, just like Pickwell, that are coming out of universities, coming out of spinouts of other corporations or de novo startups, where there's some way where that company would benefit from working closely with the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, either as a channel partner or serving them directly as a vendor, or trying to, again, use them as a channel to hit their 100 million members or physician networks, et cetera. And then, so fast forward 9.5 years, and the model's worked. It's worked well. So now we're on our third fund, and across the 3 funds, we have 31 of the 36 blue plans, and about a little over 550 million in capital to invest. And most importantly, we've been able to demonstrate that you actually can get these big organizations to collaborate, and that collaboration has helped create a bunch of value. The other thing we do along the way, so that's the payer side, we have helped stand up an entity that works more closely with providers called HealthBox. Specifically, they work with Intermountain Health out in Utah and Idaho, and they have a small fund, a $36 million fund, where they're helping Intermountain.
Great. And before we keep going, I'll just call out, we've gotten our first question, which makes us feel like someone's out there listening. So we're thrilled. So thank you. I want to identify you by name for the first question. And we will aspire to answer questions in real time, just to make sure you feel like we're paying attention. And the question was actually to have us here at Osage talk about what Osage University Partners does as well. Hopefully most of you know us, but I assume some of you don't. So here at Osage University Partners, we're a venture capital firm that invests only in university spinouts. And we partner with all of the universities that are on the phone to invest in their spinouts, and those universities share in our profit. And as part of that, we spend a lot of time deep in the pipelines and portfolios of each of our partner universities, getting to know their existing startups, and then also deep in their pipeline of new startups and talking with PIs about new startups. And we have about a little over 300 million of capital under management here and have invested in about 80 spinouts so far. So thank you again for the question, and please keep them coming. So Tom, talk about just what you're seeing in the HIT space in particular, like where are there interesting areas of activity? So for the folks listening in, where they can think about what are areas that are particularly of interest to investors in the HIT world?
Great. So I think the biggest area is, now that we've spent about a decade with a bunch of stimulus dollars, about 20 billion in stimulus dollars, trying to help providers and others digitize healthcare data. I think now the industry could use a lot of help in figuring out how to break down the data silos and actually do something with that data. So we see a ton of activity in the analytics space, in the decision support space, so like PickWell, as you pointed out earlier, and then data integration is a big deal. Like billions of dollars are being spent trying to figure out how best to utilize this data, and then also make sure that it can be that there's data liquidity. So lots of activity there, and lots of opportunity. Hasn't been solved yet.
And we'll probably come back later and talk about data a little bit, because it's an area that actually we've been interested in. How do you utilize it? Maybe I'll turn it over to David just to give you an overview of what's going on in the space from an aggregate funding standpoint, both in general and then also in specific subsectors.
Sure. So just want to mention again, I know Mark had mentioned earlier that healthcare IT is a challenging sector to track financings because the different people will define it in different ways. So whereas some analysts are going to include things like Peloton and Fitbit in the tally, we're excluding those here, and also medical device companies. And some of these are really big rounds, so you'll see numbers that differ from this. They'll be larger than these. So we've selected ones that fit our rough definition of HIT, which is essentially companies that are designing, developing, creating, and maintaining information systems for the healthcare industry. So there are also some other companies that I think are probably missing from the tally here that would also qualify under our definition. These are ones that are labeled by PitchBook and other analysts as pure software companies. But if you look, their primary vertical, their primary customers is the healthcare industry. So those also aren't being captured in this graph. So we have two axes on the left and right. The left axis says the funding levels, and the right axis is the number of deals. The orange bars are showing the funding levels for healthcare services and systems, which after we've curated that list is the companies that we're calling healthcare IT. And so what we see here is, it's unclear how 2017 is going to end up, but there does appear to be a gradual increase in the funding levels in this space. One thing to point out here, though, is those two lines, those correlate to the number of deals on the right-hand axis. So we have two lines there. And we have two lines there. One is a yellow line and one is a blue line. The yellow line is the number of deals for pharma and biotech, and the blue line is the number of deals for the healthcare IT realm. And what you see so far, for example, in 2017, you have 274 deals for pharma biotech, 222 deals closed for healthcare IT. And those deal numbers seem to track, they correlate pretty well over time. So although pharma and biotech do raise much larger funding rounds, and the aggregate capital that's poured into that sector can be twice as much as healthcare IT, the number of deals is relatively correlated over time. So just, pointing out a couple of big financings and, identifying what kinds of companies are getting these funding rounds. Nextcode is a company that specializes in genomic sequence analytics that raised $240 million this year. And a diagnostic intelligence company, Human Longevity, took in a $200 million round. So Nextcode is based in Cambridge near Boston. The last round was led by Sequoia. Human Longevity is based in San Diego, and the investors have included Illumina, Celgene, Amino, GE Ventures, and GFJ. There's also another company here that raised last year, which is worth mentioning, which is Flatiron Health, and they're providing a cloud platform that runs on AWS for researchers and doctors to share cancer patient information across from different siloed data locations. So the healthcare space is likely to continue to see a large allocation of capital as this AI approach to healthcare gains traction and more operators are adopting these services. And so the next slide here we have the top funding categories. And I'm bringing this slide up here. The main thing I want to point out is that the number one top funding category, this is from a report by Startup Health, is the big data analytics. So these numbers here also include a lot of wearables, devices, fitness products, and so forth. But last year, when they did the same report, the ranking for big data analytics was 6th. They had $500 million in funding. It was below medical devices, below the wellness companies and fitness companies and wearables. And so just from the 2016 to 2017, year over year, big data analytics companies in healthcare IT are rapidly increasing in adoption.
Great. Thanks, David. So, Tom, just a question for you. As you, in particular, as you think about these categories or other things you are investing in, if you were to guide all of our tech transfer colleagues on the call for what to look for in technologies that they're scouring through out of the university, and how to decide if it's startup worthy or not, talk kind of a little bit more granularly about, in particular, kind of, I think, the data side, which you mentioned earlier, but even more broadly, like, what for them should make a good, interesting piece of technology in HIT, and what would make something that they should stay away from?
Wow, that is a great question. It is difficult to know up front, not impossible, but it is difficult to know up front what would make a good and commercially viable product, let alone to build a company around some capability or core competency that that a researcher or some professor has developed. But I would say that where we've seen success and successful companies actually being spun out of universities, because we've invested in 6, including Pickwell, there was some element of cross collaboration across departments, either across departments in the university, or early on there was an outside party that helped ask some of the basic questions of of the lead investigator. So, what problem does this solve? What value does it create? And how can you quantify that value so that it's not just a really neat science experiment? So I would say that having some outside parties get involved early to just ask the basic questions about business model and value proposition, and then somebody that can understand the nuance of a particular sector, as Samir alluded to. Where that's done and done well, we've seen some good successes.
Yeah. And just to echo that and tie it to KenSci's story from earlier, I mean, when we've seen really interesting HIT companies from our universities, like the internal collaborative effort around creating and defining the value proposition has been kind of quick and strong and happened early, like often earlier than a traditional university startup that starts with technology and then figures out where to apply it in the marketplace. Most of the HIT companies we've found interesting kind of knew that value proposition early, or very quickly found it early, and then quickly started working with a partner, which was usually that source university, and then figured out how to, and then the hard part was how do you broaden it out from there to get other potential partners, customers, and really validate that value proposition elsewhere. One of the things that we talk a lot about here at OUP that all the panelists have hit on is data. And there's a lot of resident data in universities and their health systems. A lot of it is, some of it's utilized, a lot of it is untapped. Samir or Sunny, you guys rely on a lot of data to build the machine learning models that KenSci builds. So talk about how you get access to data. Do you believe that within universities there's a lot of untapped data? Do you think that there are other startup opportunities involved in unlocking kind of latent data within university health systems?
I'll take that question. It's a fascinating aspect, really. When we were doing our research, data was plenty, right? We had lots of data that we could access in the public domain. I think the U.S. government has done a fantastic job of opening up some of those population health data and so forth, right? But the real value of playing around with the data did not come from the data per se, but in understanding the challenge of managing that data, right? I think Tom was also speaking to that. I think there is enough and more data in health systems today. I think where most of our customers struggle is saying, I have this ocean of data, how do I make sense out of it, right? So over 4 or 5 years of research and many PhDs, PhD level effort in it, we came across the same set of problems that, we faced, and, by extension, most of our customers face today, about converting, lots of data into insight that a nurse can use or a doctor can use, right? I think those very technical problems that are hard to scale were very important learning for us because we were playing with so much data. Right? The other tactical learning that we came out with the data is the general structure of the data, right? Then as we looked at public data sets across United States, across UK, right, we realized that most data sets follow similar rhythm. Even if they do not rhyme, there are rhythms in how for example people fall sick, right? If you have diabetes, what are the chances you might get kidney failure, right? And while we were seeing the patterns, it was very difficult for just pure play data scientists and PhDs to make sense of that, right? So one of the things we did was we started collaborating with UW Medicine, which is sort of attached to University of Washington's computer science department, where we were building this out of. But it was the teaching hospital of UW, right? So we got doctors involved to give us guidance, saying, what are those, lab test results that we should track better, right? So, that helped a lot. And eventually what that morphed into was, one of the first few hires we made in the company, we actually went and hired actual doctors who could, sit next to the data scientists and bridge the gap between raw data files to machine learnable data to data that, to insights that a doctor really cares for. So, that's been our key insight from the journey.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And we've, as we've gone on a little bit of exploration in this world and tried to figure out other ways to create shared data pools or other things, it's clear there's a lot of data out there. How you massage it, integrate it, convert it, understand it is really the hard part with, what do you do with the data as opposed to just getting access to it. Well, David, maybe you can talk about some of the university spinouts we've seen here at OUP and some of the categories that we see universities creating the most HIT spinouts in.
Sure, thanks. So obviously we've seen a lot of university spinouts that are doing things with big data and AI. But in addition to that, we've also seen a lot of them doing things with protocols and best practices, education and training, workflow and decision support. So I just picked a few here that I think are doing interesting things, and they've also raised significant rounds. So the first one is Health Fidelity. This is a Columbia University spinout, and they are automated coding operations that ensure compliance for Medicare Advantage, ACA, Medicare, and accountable care organizations, and assist in risk adjustment. It's a very manually labor-intensive task, and they're automating it to help reduce costs and also to update risk assessment. Another one here is GNS Healthcare, which is an automated insights analytics company. This would be more akin to, say, what KenSci is doing, where they're finding new insights that are of value in healthcare interventions and patient stratification. The technology here is they have these causality algorithms that are used to match interventions to individuals. And this technology is actually built, it's a Cornell spinout, and it's built also on the work of some really well-known academics, Judea Pearl from UCLA, and also Stuart Kaufman, who is an emeritus professor at Penn. We also have UCLA's Voxel Cloud. This sells an automated medical image analysis service, and we've seen quite a few of these that are taking the new digitized medical imaging and doing all kinds of analysis across them to help detect early stages of cancer and to perform triage on mammogram patients and so forth. Redox is a Johns Hopkins spinout, and this is actually a very interesting one because it's providing a critical tool for all of these startups to be able to they're solving a problem that all these startups eventually have to solve, which is they're providing a set of APIs and models that help transform, normalize, and integrate data from disparate data silos. And finally, of course, we've also talked about Pickwell, which is an Osage and an Osage portfolio company, also a Sandbox investment. And this is a decision to support platform that's used by insurance carriers and brokers, and it helps people choose the right insurance plan for them.
Okay, good. And we got a question, as you were talking, David, we got a question in about the specifics, and it also relates to KenSci a little bit, which is kind of how far out are these companies from the university? Like how long ago did they license the technology? So what's kind of the distance there? And maybe Sunny or Samir, first, I think you answered this earlier, but it's probably worth commenting kind of on what was the distance between your license and your first funding?
It took us about a year to, formally start the company to the point where we raised capital, right? But it's sort of a misleading statistics. So, this research we were doing was on for 5 years, right? So it was a long time coming. We had quite a few, trials and customers, and we messed up quite a few times, right? So there were a lot of lessons under the hood. And it's only when people, other customers came forward and said, so how do we use this and how do we transact with you, that we realized that there is a company in there, right? So we formed the company, about this time in 2015, and about less than 11 months or 11 months from there, we raised our first round. But we started talking to investors about 9 months out of the gate, if that answers the question directly.
Great. And then, with Pickwell, that was also similarly quick. They came out of the university and had customers relatively quickly. So they were also within a year, I think, from license to funding. It's now been a couple of years since then. So now the company is further out. But at the time of the its first round of funding, it was pretty close to kind of its, the license itself. Dave, do you want to comment on any others?
Yeah, I would say, across the other companies, it varies a bit. On the one hand, GNS Healthcare was founded in 2000. They probably got started a little bit before that. I think they've been accumulating IP from different universities and and research from different universities along the way. Whereas Voxel Cloud is a 2016 founded startup and sort of has come right out of the gate and gotten funding. So it does vary a bit. Okay, good. So we have another question from the audience that I want to answer. That's a terrific question that relates both to healthcare IT companies, but relates broadly to university spinouts. And that relates to management teams. So basically the question asks, what do you do? It's clear what you do when you have a great management team and a great technology, then you just got to get it funded and going and apply resources to it. But what if you don't have a great management team at the start? What should you do? And the participant asked, should you go find an early CEO? Should you find somebody they call a baton carrier, which is a great term, which would be somebody like an MBA or a postdoc who can move things along? Or should you deprioritize either the opportunity or the team? And why don't, given that we do a lot in this world and have this challenge all the time, maybe I'll answer first, but then Tom, have you answer also and react to my answer. So first and foremost, if you can get the right entrepreneur, that is always best. And so it's a really, really hard thing to do, but the number one choice is always to have the right entrepreneur from the start. If you can't get the right entrepreneur, having the wrong entrepreneur is just about the worst thing you can do. And that can be a recipe for the company languishing. And if you can get a great entrepreneur, do it. From our perspective, if you can't, either the PI themselves should carry it, push it forward, but message all the way along that they are not the CEO, that they don't want to be the CEO, and the moment they find the right CEO, they will step aside for that. And you need to message that to investors, customers, other potential hires. You can also similarly have a baton carrier, to use the question as word, who does the same thing. What you don't want is a baton carrier who thinks they're the long-term CEO, because that will actually ultimately impede progress and impede a financing. So in the absence of a great CEO from the start, from our perspective, you want either the PI or a baton carrier. In both cases, you want them to clearly know, believe, and message that they're not the long-term CEO. They may have a role in the company, but they're not the long-term CEO. It's very often that we see baton carriers really want to be the CEO, and that ultimately gets in the way of progress. So Tom, how would you answer that question, or any reactions to what I just said?
Oh yeah, no, totally agree. And just looking at our companies as case studies, we have some cases where actually before we invested, there were some two of our companies had been, the founders had worked hard to try to figure out how to commercialize their technology for, in one case about 5 years, in another case about 6 years, and really just languished and did languish until they were able to bring in an experienced CEO and a good baton carrier, if you will, to use that vernacular. And then once, in one case, as they brought in the new, actually in both cases that I'm thinking about, the new business partner came in and helped them focus their products on different markets, actually change their focus, change their vision, and then was able to go and tell the story in a more compelling way, or the value proposition for what the technology could do. And then fast forward a bunch of years on both of those companies. One just sold for a lot of money, and the other one is also doing very well. And we hope ultimately we'll realize a great exit as well. But bringing in that new lead, it was so key. Otherwise, that technology would have sat in the lab. In both of those cases.
Great. So, one of the other questions we've gotten before the panel started, a number of participants submitted questions in advance, was asking about what kind of diligence VCs are doing when they're considering investing in companies like this. So maybe Samir or Sunny, you could talk about what diligence did you see? You talked to a lot of VCs. They did diligence on you. What kind of, was that diligence all the same across all those VCs? Was it different? And what do you think were the most important things you had to show in diligence?
this is hard to answer. I'll give you a very simple dichotomy here. One is of the 6 or 7 VCs we ended up talking deeply about, I think in 90% of the cases they were fairly standard due diligence questions, right? Harking back to what Tom and you just said, is the CEO the right CEO? Does the founding team have it in them to last 5 to 7 years to build this out, right? I think that was sort of important out of the gate. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of questions around unit economics, right? Saying I think because in health tech sales cycles are so long, you can model your cash burn very differently based on your unit economics, right? So I think through the fundraising process, we got coached about how to change our math, literally, right? We were our basic deal size essentially went up significantly between the time we started the raising process and the point in time when we closed the raising process, because there were so many great VCs giving us counsel saying that this is the right way to think about the deals that you are doing, right? Because coming out of university, you are very interested in the value you want to add. You are not so focused on the value you want to get out of the customer. So I think that due diligence was very critical for our ongoing success, just the cash flow and unit economics around that. And we spent a lot of cycles getting detailed on that during the diligence process. And the third piece, I think, which is the reason we chose the 3 VCs we went with, was their diligence on our culture. Right? And I cannot tell you how understated that particular axis is, right? In a culture, both in the way we shared the chemistry with David at Osage and our other VCs, but also culture within the team, right? I think in the early days, fundamentally, your product is definitely going to go through many revs, right? Your product market fit might change a little bit here and there. But what would remain true are the core cultural tenets with which you build a company. And I think, the good VCs differentiated themselves from the bad ones by, spending a lot of time on due diligence that you cannot present, right? You have to feel it. So, the folks would come to our office, sit down, work with us, see people in action, understand how we hire. And we literally didn't hire anybody based on web submissions, right? We hired people who came to us saying, I really want to do this. Right? There was this deep sense of commitment from them to do it. We had taken the pains to define at least the outline of the nature of company we want to build from a cultural standpoint. And the VCs we eventually ended up signing with spent a lot of time understanding those core tenets. So, recapping a little bit, the team commitment, the executive commitment, the cash flow economics, and the culture. I think those 3 things were what we spent most of our time in the diligence process.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'd say kind of those, like when we're thinking about investing in a company that's in particular selling software to whether it's hospitals or payers or other things, like the sales cycle is always long, and getting comfortable with the dynamics around that sales cycle is a really important thing. Maybe we should take a second and just talk about who some of the large investors are in the space. The reason we do this is we want our tech transfer partners to know if you're ever trying to start a company, these are some of the firms you should be calling. If you want introductions to them, we can provide introductions, or others can. So David, you want to just walk through what's here?
Right, so I broke them out into sort of overall healthcare IT investors across all stages. And then I also put the top seed investors in this space as well, depending on where the startup is right now. So I'll start on the left. We're happy to have Sandbox here. They were kind of tied for #1 spot among the institutional investors. So you'll notice here there are 6 institutional investors and there are 4 strategics. You see a lot of strategics investing in this space. Norwest, F Prime, Khosla, GE is done the most deals so far this year. And from the seed investors, the #1 spot is, in the number of the spots are given by the 2017 year-to-date number of deals. So Ben Franklin here in Philadelphia has done 17, Dream Adventures, 500 startups. Enterprise Ireland is probably not one that we'd recommend just because it's US. But we've all heard of like Great Oaks, Rock Health is a good one, StartX is Stanford, and Y Combinator. These are all decent places to send your pitch deck.
And again, we know many of these people, so if you're interested in introductions, just let us know. I'd also say that there, at times, is a rotation among tech investors into the HIT space. And so we've talked about this on other webinars where sometimes you see tech investors interested in diagnostics companies because they think of them as digital health companies. And so anything relates to data, even if it's health related, sometimes we'll see tech investors who we would not normally think of as HIT investors kind of move into the space. One of the other questions we had received in advance of the webinar related to very specific deal terms for our healthcare IT companies. And so it was actually helpful to have it in advance. We were able to do some research around this and come up with an informed answer. So I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten Loida, who's here with us. She's an Osage University Partners team member that runs our university relations team and is responsible for our license database, where we have collected about 1,000 startup licenses from universities, and so have a deep sense of deal terms, and she'll answer some of those questions.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, we got some great questions beforehand regarding the structure of deal terms, license deals out of universities to these startups and then HIT. And I think the overall thing to keep in mind, of course, with these licenses, that these are often hybrid types of deals. So hybrid types, there's different types of IP are going into these deals, be it patent applications, copyright, data, or other information that's going into these licenses. And because of this, they don't necessarily follow a certain type of deal structure. So for example, on equity, there are some cases potentially where these could be equity-only deals, but that's probably only going to be the case if it's a software-only deal. If there are other types of intellectual property that are going into the license, this is going to be much more like the typical license that you see out of a university involving other types of payments, including royalties, upfront payments potentially, and other things. For trademarks, there are many cases where the universities have already started building up these programs themselves and have built a trademark that is recognizable around the program, and so those may also be a part of the deal itself, and that may be something that is licensed then, and the company then either takes over that trademark or the university maintains it and the company works with them on that. We have not seen much in the way of design patents, though, associated with HIT deals, but I'd be curious if other people on the call have ever seen that. Of course, one of the things that I think for the license deal structures out of universities that you need to pay attention to is actually having the ownership associated with what it is that you're licensing out. We talked earlier about big data, if that's being potentially associated with the license, or other types of information that are being included. And being aware, of course, of any third-party ownership and obligations associated with the license. And then also we had looked into both sub-licensing and royalties. For the royalty structures and under HIT deals, typically like a regular license deal, if there's a patent associated with it, this is going to be a typical royalty associated with the life of the patent. But because there's often a hybrid situation here, like I said, between patents and copyrights, it's often a combination perhaps of a life of the patent royalty or a step down in royalties over time, as the copyright does not contain as much of what was actually developed at the university, but is more built at the company itself. For sub-licensing terms under the deals, I think that this is very similar to other types of deals. And again, this is based on discussions that I've had with other universities, as well as my own experience in the past at Stanford University, that sub-licensing often is included, associated with exclusivity of the license, and there would be pass-through on royalties in those cases. But if there is use sub-licensing associated with the copyright then being licensed out, of course, that would follow the typical software licensing structure.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. I'd say if anyone has follow-up questions on specific deal licensing terms, we have a tremendous amount of information about it, and we're happy to answer your questions and help guide you. Our goal is to help you figure out what are the right deal terms so you can do more licensing to startups. By the way, we have just a couple of minutes left, so if anybody has any final questions that they feel like have not been answered, now would be the time to go ahead and submit them, and we'll try to answer them. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and do it now. One of the challenges and questions we often see with I'll call it software startups, and with many HIT startups being software-based, is whether the university IP really matters. Like, do you need a patent to have a spin out? How important is the license? And, so Tom, from your perspective, talk about the importance of IP. You said you've done 6 university spin outs. How much does the university IP matter to you?
That's a good question. So, it depends on the business model and the use case. So for one of our spin outs, IP was very important, and the company spent 4 years working to secure 100 patents worldwide, and we spent a lot of money and a lot of time and effort doing that. But that turned out to be very key, as some big corporations like GE and others tried to work around our patent portfolio, so we were able to beat that down. For other companies that are more focused on delivering value through improved workflow or clinical decision support, or just decision support in general, IP is less important. It's more important to design the system and use the intelligence in a way that creates value, and then it's more important to have really good sales and marketing folks, I would say. And we saw that with a company called Nexidia that did audio analytics. Had some interesting use cases, but again, it just depends on the business model and the sector that the company's innovating in.
Yeah, and I would say we generally find here that it's almost always really important to the foundation of the company, to the start, and kind of the early couple of years. Over time, it's generally the nature of software and data that it evolves, and so you wind up writing code that's no longer the original code you were using at the university. And so over a reasonable period of time, the license and the patent itself actually becomes less relevant, but is important early on in the formation of the company. And it's just important to keep those in mind as you're thinking about deal terms around that and what are the right terms. So we have another question, which I'm actually not so we actually have 2 more questions that we will try to hit. One, this is a question for Samir or to Sunny, which is talk about how you decided when to spin out of the university. So how did you know that the time was right to do it now as opposed to waiting?
For us, it was very binary. Customer came up and said, "How do I buy this?" Right, and we didn't have a structure to transact. So we said, "Look, this has, as part of a research project, this has gone beyond what we thought it would go. But now that we have a customer willing to buy us, it makes buy from us. It made the most logical sense to establish a company and start a commercial operation. So it was very simple from that perspective."
Good. And then I think the last question that we have time to answer, which was from one of the participants, comes back to the IP side, which is whether before approaching investors, does the IP license already need to be negotiated between the spin out and the university, or can it be done at the time of the first round of investment? So Tom, what's your perspective on that?
That's a good question. I mean, ideally, that's already been settled, and so that question would have been answered. But it never hurts to approach investors early on and get feedback, and just to start the conversation. So if it's in process, and you think the company there's an opportunity to commercialize that technology, then I'd say go ahead and start reaching out to investors.
And I'd say here we see a broad range around that, where sometimes it's fully negotiated, probably more often than not. Like if it's a seed round, like the first round of the company, sometimes it's fully negotiated. Often there's an option, and the license isn't done, and sometimes it's not. There's nothing, and except communication between the tech transfer office and the startup, and that company can still get funded. It's really important to have the communication. And for a seed round, it's not 100% necessary from our standpoint that the license needs to be fully executed. So I think we're now out of time. First, I want to say thank you to Tom, Samir, and Sunny, as well as David. It was really helpful to have all of your input. We would love to get your feedback in a survey. So, you know, it's the only way we get better at these and we learn. So in the chat box should be a link to the survey. We just put that in. So you'll see in the chat box a link to a SurveyMonkey survey. It would be great if you would click on the link and go ahead and fill out the survey just so we could learn what we could do better. You'll also see on the screen now the emails both for Tom and Samir if you want to reach out and contact them directly with anything. And as always, you should feel free to contact any of us at Osage University Partners with any follow-up questions. This webinar has also been recorded and will be saved, and we'll distribute a link to that. So if you have other colleagues who want to participate who could not listen in today, we'll make sure to distribute the link so you can send it to them. And if you don't get it, feel free to follow up with us to request it. So with that, we're going to go ahead and draw this to a conclusion. So thank you to all of our participants for joining us. Thank you to Tom and Samir and Sunny for all of your really helpful content. And then we'll be having another webinar relatively shortly on university translational funds for therapeutics, so therapeutic development funds to progress therapeutics further in-house as opposed to pushing them out into a spin-out early. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again, and we look forward to talking to all of you soon. Take care.